Hey guys, I'm just getting a couple more things lined up here and we'll get started in a minute or two. All right, we'll go ahead and get started here. Looks like most of you guys are logged in at this point. I hope that everyone enjoyed their long weekend. So last time we started chapter 1, and we've got 2 more days that we're going to be on chapter 1. And I do have a couple of announcements that, oh, we got a couple of more folks joining us here. A couple of announcements before we continue. So I did go ahead and update the chapter quizzes so that the chapter quizzes are now worth 25 points each. They were set to be worth 20. That was an error, and they are now correctly set at 25 points. I also wanted to reiterate to you guys that I did post the first couple chapters of I did post your first couple of chapters of your textbook here to Canvas. You can see them here under complementary textbook chapters. The first 2, you'll have to be on your own after the first 2 chapters. Hopefully by the time we get to chapter 3, you guys will have acquired your textbooks, but that'll give a little bit of wiggle room to folks who are behind on that. Also, your first 5 chapter quizzes are due on February 10th. So just to reiterate, in case you guys forgot, the way that I have the exams set up is that you guys will have those quizzes for those chapters due the day of the class meeting before the exam. So for example, your first exam is on Tuesday, February 15th. So your first 5 chapter quizzes are due the night of Thursday night, February 10th by midnight. So those chapter quizzes are going to be a major way that you guys are going to study for exams, in addition to the study guides that I have posted. All right, so last time we started chapter 1 and we were starting to get into the history of sociological theory. And we got through the ideas of Auguste Comte. And we talked a little bit, we were starting to get a little bit into the ideas of Emile Durkheim. But let me recap a little bit of that stuff before I jump right in where we left off. Okay, you guys should have a full screen view at this point. I'm not going to re-go through all of these, but I do want to recap from this point. Okay, so in sociology, there are 2 broad levels of analysis. We discussed this last time. So we talked about the micro level, which pertains to everyday social interactions. So for example, if a sociologist were to come into a classroom and study the interactions of individuals within that classroom, then we would be looking at microsociology, right? Sometimes this is referred to as social psychology. There's a lot of overlap there. Psychologists call it social psychology. Sociologists call it microsociology, but there's a significant degree of overlap, and we're going to be spending an entire chapter talking about group dynamics, which is all microsociology. But a lot of what we talk about, if not most of what we focus on in this class, at least I'd say 70% of the time, we're discussing macro level theory in this course, right? We're looking at the large scale social institutions and how they affect their lives. So this is kind of a progression of the macro to the micro, right? So at the macro level, we're looking at society as a whole and the culture that runs that society. And then we look at the individual social institutions within that society, right? And how those social institutions give rise to inequality, and say like between groups, our roles within groups. Now we're starting to get into microsociology. Once we start to get into the group and below here, we're getting into the micro realm here, right? And this is sort of the bridge between the macro and the micro in this area. So last time we talked about kind of the early history of theory in sociology. So theories are big ideas, right? Theories are sets of big ideas that attempt to help us understand how the world works, right? So theories are big picture ideas that attempt to explain the world, and theories generate hypotheses. So hypotheses are particular predictions that come out of theories, right? But theories generate hypotheses. And the first major theorist that we talked about last time was Auguste Comte. He is generally considered the founder of sociology. He was the person who coined the term sociology, and he came up with this idea known as positivism, which is the idea that we should use the scientific method to run the world. This is what's known as positivism, and he proposed sociology's existence, although he really didn't do much with the idea. He wasn't really terribly successful in his own life. But it was actually later intellectuals, such as Harriet Martineau, for example, and others like John Stuart Mill, who took Comte's ideas and popularized them. Excuse me, I've been sneezing a lot today, and I'm not sure why. Okay, so I apologize in advance if I sneeze on into the microphone or it startles anybody. I'll try to catch it and mute the mic before it happens. I thought one was about to happen just now. But Harriet Martineau was an early feminist and writer, and she translated Comte's work into English from French, and she did a lot to popularize his writings, as did the famous British intellectual John Stuart Mill. So it was really Martineau and John Stuart Mill who popularized Comte's ideas, but it was Comte who proposed sociology's existence. Now, the other guy we talked about last time a little bit was Herbert Spencer, and he's kind of, he was a really smart guy in the sense that he was very well educated and he knew a lot of stuff, and he was very eloquent in his writings, if you read his writings. But his ideas were, historically speaking, now considered harmful to the world in the sense that not because he promoted Darwinism, but because he promoted this idea of social Darwinism that we talked about last time, right? And it was actually Herbert Spencer who popularized this phrase, survival of the fittest, not Charles Darwin, which is a misconception. But Herbert Spencer was a proponent of social Darwinism and the eugenics movement. And a lot of his ideas were taken up by extremist thinkers. And in fact, the eugenics movement was really sort of a dark stain on human history, particularly here in the United States, particularly in Europe. There were folks who were sterilized against their will, people who were prevented from having children because some person in the government or some authority figure deemed a person unfit for reproduction, right? And there were thousands and thousands of people who were sterilized against their will as the result of the eugenics movement. And Herbert Spencer was largely seen as sort of the intellectual voice behind the eugenics movement. So although he was a very brilliant man, he was very eloquent in his writings, his ideas were used to really do a lot of harm, and the field of sociology has gotten away from his ideas and his thinking. So even though we have to acknowledge him in the history books as contributing to the field of sociology has gotten away from his way of thinking, and his views are kind of seen these days as a dark stain on the history of sociology. So no worries to the person that messaged me about being late. It's all good. So we ended with an introduction to the ideas of Emil Durkheim. Of all of the names we've discussed in this chapter up to this point, Durkheim's the biggest name so far that you guys have heard. Durkheim was the first sociology professor. He was the first person to have that title in the world. He was a sociology professor at the Sorbonne in France, and he was the very first sociology professor. And his most well-known book was his book Les Suicides, which was a study of suicide rates in Europe, and it was really avant-garde for his time. He did this study of suicide rates, and what he found, as we saw in the talk that we watched last time, the video that I played for you guys at the end of class, was that he noticed that as industrial capitalism was taking over, he believed in the scientific method. He used it to study suicide rates. He found that there was this correlation between the rise of industrial capitalism and an increase in suicide rates. He saw that people weren't relating to each other in the same ways that they used to under the agrarian economy. Before the Industrial Revolution, when everyone related to each other in the same way, everybody basically had the same job, everybody had the same religion, everybody was basically the same. This was a state of what Durkheim called mechanical solidarity, where everybody kind of was the same. But after the Industrial Revolution, it shook up people's worldviews. We were now, we're putting our faith in science now instead of religion. And jobs are specialized. Everybody has a specialized job. People can't relate to each other like the way they used to in the agrarian world. Everybody kind of has their own specialized existence in industrial capitalism, which leads to this sense of normlessness or despair that he talked about, which he called anomie. Actually, I need to make a note to myself here. Sorry. When I have a thought that I need to remember, I always have to write it down immediately and interrupt what I'm doing to write it down so I don't forget about it. But he had this idea called anomie, which was this idea that people are becoming more disconnected, a sense of despair that arose out of the Industrial Revolution, out of disconnection, that he called anomie. A-N-O-M-I-E was the term that he used. And in fact, I'll put that into the chat box for you guys. But the modern world and industrial capitalism, according to Durkheim, caused an increase in a sense of what he referred to as anomie, which is this sense of despair or hopelessness brought on by the modern world. And he really believed that industrial capitalism was changing the way that people live their lives so rapidly that a lot of people were having trouble dealing with those rapid changes. And in fact, of all of the sociologists that we talk about in this course, and the theoretical orientations that we talk about, structural functionalism which is what Durkheim is known for. His theoretical orientation became known as structural functionalism. It's generally seen as one of the more conservative viewpoints in sociology. Let me put that in the chat box for you guys as well. But structural functionalism is the theoretical orientation associated with the work of Durkheim. And it's one of the three major theoretical orientations that we're going to be talking about in this class. So don't worry if this isn't all sinking in right now. I know it's a lot of information all at once, but a lot of it's going to get repeated over and over again. But Durkheim was one of the first folks to kind of utilize the scientific method to actually study society. In his work, Durkheim demonstrated the effectiveness of using the empirical methods to study what he called social reality, essentially completing the project that Comte had proposed, right? So Comte proposed this, but it was Durkheim who put it into action. So it was really Durkheim who got the field of sociology off the ground. In his first major study, The Division of Labor in Society, which he published in 1893, Durkheim expressed his belief that social bonds were present in all types of societies, but that different types of societies created different types of bonds. He suggested that mechanical solidarity experienced by people in agrarian societies bound them together on the basis of their shared beliefs and customs. On the other hand, industrial societies, where factory work was becoming increasingly specialized, comprised what he termed organic solidarity. People's bonds with each other were based upon individual dependence, right? People's bonds with each other were based upon this sense of interdependence and individual rights. So again, in the agrarian world, people were connected to each other through a sense of what Durkheim called mechanical solidarity, but in the modern world, people are bound together by more what he referred to as organic solidarity. So let's take a quicker look at this idea of mechanical versus organic solidarity from Durkheim. Give me a second to get this next video queued up for you guys. So the distinction between organic and mechanical solidarity is this is a central concept in Durkheim's thinking. So definitely pay attention to this video because you'll need to be familiar with this distinction between mechanic and organic solidarity, which your textbook spends a lot of time on also.
Durkheim is sometimes seen as a sociologist whose ideas are similar to the core ideas of the conservative ideology. For example, his concepts of social cohesion, social regulation, social consciousness, the role of the church, or the functions of marriage. But Durkheim cannot be pigeonholed that easily. In his first major study, published in 1893, on the division of social labor, de la division du travail social, a title, by the way, that reminds us of Mondeville and of Adam Smith, he presents an argument that is directed against the complaints of conservative and even romantic admirers of traditional societies. Durkheim says that in the societies of the past, everybody resembled everybody. People were similar, and the similarity was, as it were, the social cement. Think of a medieval small city where everybody shares the same religion, where people are not yet highly specialized, they are not yet working in very different branches of the economic world, because the division of labor is still in a very early stage. In such societies, he says, we see that, they are glued together by mechanical solidarity. The individuals that constitute such a society are pretty identical, like the cogs in a large machine. Now, conservatives complain that in modern societies, that kind of cement is crumbling to pieces. And in a way, Durkheim agrees. But it doesn't alarm him, because he says, A new type of solidarity is now taking shape in front of our own eyes. Yes, it's true. People in modern societies are not very similar anymore. They believe in different gods. They have jobs that are so different that one craftsman doesn't have the slightest idea of what the other craftsman does. All of that is true, but it shouldn't lead us to believe that those people show a lower degree of solidarity. On the contrary, now they are bound together by a different kind of ties. The more people differ from one another, the more they need one another, the more they are dependent upon one another. The differentiation and the specialization between jobs, for example, professions, social functions, has reached such a high level that human beings and groups of human beings have become extremely interdependent now. They need one another. They cannot survive without each other. This is clearly not the old type of interdependence through similarity. It is more the opposite. It is interdependence through dissimilarity. Heterogeneity breeds interdependence. And this is the social glue that Durkheim calls organic solidarity. In the great tradition of the organicist sociological thinkers like Herbert Spencer, Durkheim compares here societies with biological entities, with living bodies. In primitive organisms, the body parts may be very similar, but in the higher organisms, the organs have differentiated to such a degree that the body as a whole cannot survive unless those interdependent organs work together in a perfect fashion. We cannot think, we cannot have consciousness. You cannot understand this lecture without the oxygen that the heart pumps through the stream of blood from the lungs into the brain. The differentiation of the organs in the bodies of the higher organisms has created new possibilities, but it also has created new vulnerabilities. And that is the reason why the units within such a body are very interdependent. It's the reason why those well-integrated organisms cannot survive if one of the vital organs doesn't work the way it should. And it is just the same with modern societies. They cannot survive if you would take away, well, for example, one professional group. Let's say all the school teachers or all the train drivers. This organic interdependence is the new source of solidarity. The conservative thinkers who believe that the disappearance of solidarity through similarity is the reason why modern societies will fall to pieces have completely overlooked this important new source of solidarity. I have the impression that Durkheim wants to attract the attention of his audience here by using his terms in a non-intuitive fashion. Conservative thinkers had a tendency to describe traditional societies as organic wholes, where every part was related to every other part in a more or less natural way, and to describe modern societies as broken to bits and pieces by mechanical forces, the forces that dominate in the machine age. Now, Durkheim turns this whole terminology upside down. Traditional societies, he says, are kept together by mechanical solidarity, solidarity by similarity. Modern societies, on the other hand, by organic solidarity. Durkheim must have been an excellent teacher, someone who knew that when you use your terms in a way that goes against the expectations of your listeners or of your readers, then they may be shocked out of their habitual ways of reasoning. And then they may pay attention to the unconventional insight that you want to convey.
All right, So you guys should have the slides back in your view now. Let me know if that's not the case. I was having an issue there for a second. So there's a lot to unpack here with the ideas of Durkheim, and we're probably not going to be exposed to every single one of his ideas in one day, but what you guys need to know for today about Durkheim is that he was the very first real sociology professor there in France at the Sorbonne. And the view of society that he came up with, his theoretical viewpoint, has later come to be known as structural functionalism. And in structural functionalism, we view society like an organism, like the human body, where all of the different parts, all of the different organs have to work together in order for society to continue to work, in order for society to continue to stay stable and working the way it's supposed to. So society is like a human body or an organism, and all of the different parts have to work together. Structural functionalism is sometimes seen as a more conservative viewpoint within sociology, because there's this way of kind of wanting to protect the status quo, kind of wanting to protect order, kind of wanting to protect stability. Which is a very different way of looking at things from the next major theoretical viewpoint that I want to introduce you guys to, and that's conflict theory. So conflict theory is associated with the work of the German philosopher and economist / lawyer, Karl Marx. And Karl Marx certainly has people tend to love him or hate him, depending on your political viewpoints. So people who lean to the left politically tend to be fans of Marx. People who are more conservative, who lean to the right, tend to be not fans of Marx. As a moderate myself politically, as you might expect, I have sort of an ambivalent view of Karl Marx. Meaning that I have a mixed view of Marx. But before I get into my opinion of Marx, what did he actually have to say? Well, Marx believed that really the central thing that ran the world was economic relationships. In other words, he believed that social inequality was what really made the world run, right? That the only relationships that really matter between people are economic relationships. So Karl Marx liked to boil down everything to economic relationships, which I think is a little bit of an oversimplification of the human experience, but he believed that all human relationships could be boiled down to economics, basically, like what can you give me and what can I give you, right? What do we have to offer each other, basically? And that it is the conflict between those who have and those who do not that runs the world. In other words, those who have power, whom he referred to as the bourgeoisie. Sometimes you'll hear the term bougie, right? It's from that term. But the bourgeoisie, they're the folks who have the wealth and the resources. They own what he referred to as the means of production, which are your factories, your banks, your resources, the land, right? All of the means of production. They own the means of production, and the workers are kind of just in a situation of having nothing to offer but their labor, right? And you have a situation where, according to Marx, those in power are exploiting those at the bottom. And Marx believed that capitalism was all to blame for this, right? So kind of a central theme that we see in early sociology was that the rise of industrial capitalism actually sort of spurred sociology's existence, right? Now, again, I'll say that structural functionalism and the ideas of Durkheim have traditionally been considered more conservative ideologies in sociology, and conflict theory, which is associated with Marx, is usually associated with more left-wing or liberal thought in sociology. But Marx ultimately believed that the conflict between the haves and the have-nots was essentially what made the world run. And he believed that eventually that capitalism would be overthrown. He thought that capitalism would eventually be replaced with a system in which everybody was equal. We might call that communism, right? But basically a society in which There's no private property. Everybody has an equal income. Everybody has equal social status, right? This is the utopian communist vision that has, nobody's ever actually been able to pull it off yet. And interestingly, every single country that's attempted to institute a classless communist society has eventually over the years become more and more capitalistic. I think of Russia and China as top examples. But in any case, Marx believed that eventually capitalism would be replaced with a classless society. He believed that people would eventually have enough of capitalism, and that those at the bottom, the proletariat, would overthrow the capitalists at the top, the bourgeoisie, and that we would end up with a classless society. That prediction has not come true at all. And in fact, capitalism is stronger and here to, I think that it's more alive and well than it's ever been. You hear some folks on the left talk about late stage capitalism. I'm incredibly skeptical of that term. Of course, capitalism will grow and evolve with time, as it has already, but it's more here to stay than it's ever been, in my educated opinion. I think Marx underestimated the degree to which capitalism would make a lot of people very rich, right? So, his prediction that capitalism would be overthrown has not come true. In fact, it's gotten stronger over the years. Inequality has increased. Actually, maybe it just hasn't happened yet. Maybe eventually the inequality will increase to the point where we have had enough of it and it will be overthrown, but we haven't gotten there yet. And I don't see any signs that that's happening. Although some folks are more politically left-leaning these days, I really don't see capitalism going anywhere. Personally, I just don't see that happening. But Marx believed that it would eventually disappear. Now, I will say this for Marx, though. Industrial capitalism, as it existed in his day and age, was very brutal. We didn't have the 40-hour work week. We didn't have overtime laws. We didn't have OSHA, workplace protections for safety. We didn't have child labor laws. We didn't have labor unions. All of these things that provide some degree of protection to workers that we have now that are just kind of standard. Well, except for maybe unions, depending on where you live. But a lot of these protections that we have in place for workers today didn't exist in Marx's day. So a lot of the criticisms that he made of capitalism, those criticisms actually spurred the creation of these laws and workers' protections, right? So we can actually, to some degree, thank Marx for criticizing capitalism, because his criticisms led to the more kinder, gentler capitalism that we have today. Now, are more reforms probably needed? More regulations? Probably. But we have a kinder, gentler capitalism today because of Marx. We have protections for workers that did not exist before he put his ideas out into the world. So we can likely thank Marx for the existence of these protections for workers. At the same time, though, where I have ambivalence about Marx, where I'm not such a fan, is that a lot of his ideas have been used by dictators and oppressors throughout the 20th century to perpetuate untold humanitarian horrors. If you look at some of the things that have been done in Marx's name in Russia and in China and in Cuba and in Cambodia, and I'm just naming a few places that come to my mind. If you look at some of the things that have been done in Marx's names throughout the 20th century, it'll just make you shudder with terror. So a lot of Marx's ideas have been misappropriated, in my opinion, to cause a lot of violence and upheaval in the world, particularly in the 20th century. But with that criticism aside, a lot of his ideas have been used to improve capitalism and make it kinder and gentler. So again, my take of Marx is very mixed, right? I kind of have a love-hate relationship with him. On the one hand, his ideas were used to make capitalism kinder and gentler and better regulated. On the other hand, though, his ideas have been used to perpetuate humanitarian horrors throughout the 20th century. So again, I personally have sort of a mixed view of Marx. But at this point, let's take a look at this clip on Marx from the School of Life. thoughts, comments on Marx, please. I welcome them as the video is playing. Let me know what you guys think of Marx's ideas. Love them, hate them. Just stay respectful of each other, right? That's all I ask. Just be respectful of each other. If you see a classmate say something you vehemently disagree with, remember, just stay respectful. No personal attacks. All right, so I'd love to hear what you guys think of Marx, or read what you guys think of Marx's ideas as we're watching this video.
Most people agree that we need to improve our economic system somehow. Yet we're also often keen to dismiss the ideas of capitalism's most famous and ambitious critic, Karl Marx. This isn't very surprising. In practice, his political and economic ideas have been used to design disastrously planned economies and nasty dictatorships. Nevertheless, we shouldn't reject Marx too quickly. We ought to see him as a guide whose diagnosis of capitalism's ills helps us to navigate towards a more promising future. Capitalism is going to have to be reformed, and Marx's analyses are going to be part of any answer. Marx was born in 1818 in Trier in Germany. Soon he became involved with the Communist Party, a tiny group of intellectuals advocating for the overthrow of the class system and the abolition of private property. He worked as a journalist and had to flee Germany, eventually settling in London. Marx wrote an enormous number of books and articles, sometimes with his friend Friedrich Engels. Mostly, Marx wrote about capitalism, the type of economy that dominates the Western world. It was, in his day, still getting going, and Marx was one of its most intelligent and perceptive critics. These were some of the problems he identified with it. Modern work is alienated. One of Marx's greatest insights is that work can be one of the sources of our greatest joys. But in order to be fulfilled at work, Marx wrote that workers need to see themselves in the objects they have created. Think of the person who built this chair. It's straightforward, strong, honest, and elegant. It's an example of how, at its best, labor offers us a chance to externalize what's good inside us. But this is increasingly rare in the modern world. Part of the problem is that modern work is incredibly specialized. Specialized jobs make the modern economy highly efficient, but they also mean that it's seldom possible for any one worker to derive a sense of the genuine contribution they might be making to the real needs of humanity. Marx argued that modern work leads to alienation, Entfremdung. In other words, a feeling of disconnection between what you do all day and who you feel you really are and what you think you'd ideally be able to contribute to existence. Modern work is insecure. Capitalism makes the human being utterly expendable, just one factor among others in the forces of production, and one that can ruthlessly be let go the minute that costs rise or savings can be made through technology. And yet, as Marx knew deep inside each of us, we don't want to be arbitrarily let go. We're terrified of being abandoned. Communism isn't just an economic theory. Understood emotionally, it expresses a deep-seated longing that we always have a place in the world's heart, that we will not be cast out. Workers get paid little, while capitalists get rich. This is perhaps the most obvious qualm that Marx had with capitalism. In particular, he believed that capitalists shrink the wages of the laborers as much as possible in order to skim off a wide profit margin. He called this primitive accumulation, ursprüngliche Akkumulation. Whereas capitalists see profit as a reward for ingenuity and technological talent, Marx was far more damning. Profit is simply theft, and what you're stealing is the talent and hard work of your workforce. However much one dresses up the fundamentals, Marx insists that at its crudest, capitalism means paying a worker one price for doing something and then selling it to somebody else at a much higher price. Profit is the fancy term for exploitation. Capitalism is very unstable. Marx proposed that capitalist systems are characterized by a series of crises. Every crisis is dressed up by capitalists as being somehow freakish and rare and soon to be the last one. Far from it, argued Marx. Crises are endemic to capitalism, and they're caused by something rather odd. The fact that we're able to produce too much, far more than anyone needs to consume. Capitalist crises are crises of abundance, rather than, as in the past, crises of shortage. Our factories and systems are so efficient, we could give everyone on this planet a car, a house, access to a decent school and a hospital. And that's what so enraged Marx, but also made him so hopeful too. Few of us actually need to work because the modern economy is so productive. But rather than seeing this need not to work as the freedom it is, we complain about it masochistically and describe it by a pejorative word, unemployment. We should call it freedom. There's so much unemployment for a good and deeply admirable reason, because we're so good at making things efficiently. We're not all needed at the coalface. But in that case, we should, thought Marx, make leisure admirable. We should redistribute the wealth of the massive corporations that make so much surplus money and give it to everyone. This is, in its own way, as beautiful a dream as Jesus' promise of heaven, but a good deal more realistic sounding. Capitalism is bad for capitalists. Marx didn't think that capitalists were evil. For example, he was acutely aware of the sorrows and secret agonies that lay behind bourgeois marriage. Marx argued that marriage was actually an extension of business, and that the bourgeois family was fraught with tension, oppression, and resentment, with people staying together not for love, but for financial reasons. Marx believed that the capitalist system forces everyone to put economic interests at the heart of their lives, so that they can no longer know deep, honest relationships. He called this psychological tendency commodity fetishism, Warenfetischismus, because it makes us value things that have no objective value. He wanted people to be freed from financial constraint so that they could, at last, start to make sensible, healthy choices in their relationships. The 20th century feminist answer to the oppression of women has been to argue that women should simply be able to go out to work. But Marx's answer was more subtle. This feminist insistence merely perpetuates human slavery. The point isn't that women should imitate the sufferings of their male colleagues. It's that men and women should have the permanent option to enjoy leisure. Why don't we all think a bit more like Marx? An important aspect of Marx's work is that he proposes that there's an insidious, subtle way in which the economic system colours the sort of ideas that we end up having. The economy generates what Marx termed an ideology. A capitalist society is one where most people, rich and poor, believe all sorts of things that are really just value judgments that relate back to the economic system. For example, that a person who doesn't work is worthless, that leisure beyond a few weeks a year is sinful, that more belongings will make us happier, and that worthwhile things and people will invariably make money. In short, one of the biggest evils of capitalism is not that there are corrupt people at the top. This is true in any human hierarchy. But that capitalist ideas teach all of us to be anxious, competitive, conformist, and politically complacent. Marx didn't only outline what was wrong with capitalism. We also get glimpses of what Marx wanted the ideal utopian future to be like. In his Communist Manifesto, he describes a world without private property or inherited wealth, with a steeply graduated income tax, centralized control of the banking, communication, and transport industries, and free public education. Marx also expected that communist society would allow people to develop lots of different sides of their natures. In communist society, it's possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic. After Marx moved to London, he was supported by his friend and intellectual partner Friedrich Engels, a wealthy man whose father owned a cotton plant in Manchester. Engels covered Marx's debts and made sure his works were published. Capitalism paid for communism. The two men even wrote each other adoring poetry. Marx was not a well-regarded or popular intellectual in his day. Respectable, conventional people of Marx's day would have laughed at the idea that his ideas could remake the world. Yet just a few decades later they did. His writings became the keystone for some of the most important ideological movements of the 20th century. But Marx was like a brilliant doctor in the early days of medicine. He could recognize the nature of the disease, although he had no idea how to go about curing it. At this point in history, we should all be Marxists, in the sense of agreeing with his diagnosis of our troubles. But we need to go out and find the cures that really will work. As Marx himself declared, and we deeply agree, philosophers until now have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it.
So Marx was the intellectual father of conflict theory, which is a really prominent orientation within the discipline of sociology. Why am I hearing sounds here coming out of my monitor?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this Intelligence Squared debate on the motion.
Okay, sorry about that. Back to slides. Some great comments from you guys coming in during the video there. So, you guys had some insightful comments. I think the biggest issue that a lot of folks run into, which was mentioned in the chat box, is the issue that people have with Marxist theory, and it's the issue that I have with it, and I don't have an answer to this question: to what degree can we control human greed? Right? Marx believed that if we just met everybody's basic needs, if everybody had what they needed, then people would settle down and quit being violent and people would behave themselves, right? I'm not entirely convinced that people would, just suddenly become happy and stop acting up if they had all of their basic needs suddenly met. I'm skeptical of that idea. Marx seemed to really believe in that idea. But I'm not entirely convinced that even if everybody had their basic needs met, that we wouldn't just find something to be pissed off about or find some drama to create as a species, right? And I think there's always going to be that select group of people who's going to want to hoard things, even if everybody has their needs taken care of. Perhaps I'm too skeptical. Perhaps I'm too cynical of human nature and selfishness. I have sort of a love-hate relationship with Marx myself, because on the one hand, I'm a member of an individualist society. I'm someone who's benefited from capitalism, and as someone who's benefited from capitalism, I certainly have no intention of doing away with it, right? But on the other hand, I have to acknowledge that Marx's ideas have been used to mix effect in the world. So, for example, many dictators like Lenin, like Stalin, like Pol Pot, like Mao Zedong, not countless, but several dictators have, as mentioned in that video that we just watched, utilized Marx ideas to exercise humanitarian horrors that you'll never be able to visualize. In the 20th century, folks like Stalin and Pol Pot and members of communist parties were responsible for more human deaths than happened in the Holocaust, actually, you could argue. Stalin in particular, Joseph Stalin, the communist dictator of Russia, you could make the argument that he was actually statistically responsible for more deaths than Hitler was, right? So yes, Marx's ideas have been used for ill effect in the world. However, on the other hand, Marx's criticisms of capitalism have been used to make capitalism kinder and gentler. So Marx is sort of a mixed bag, right? He's awoken us to the evils of capitalism, and he's been a great critic of capitalism, but his solutions at how to fix capitalism maybe so far haven't worked out so well. Let's check in on the comments here. Let's see. How much is wanting more an American trait? I don't know. I don't know if it's uniquely American. I'm skeptical that it's uniquely American, but I think we have a lot. I think that we are definitely more avaricious and more individualistic than many other cultures, but I'm skeptical of the idea that Americans are the only people that If this topic interests you in the slightest, I recommend reading a bit of his writing. Not the easiest. Yeah, I've read a little bit of Marx's work. Yeah, I've definitely read the Manifesto like everybody else in college. I've read a little bit of Das Kapital. There's a lot to Marx. There's a lot to dive into there, and he had a lot of interesting ideas. And I'm not someone who either vilifies or worships him, right? I see Marx as very nuanced. I'm not a Marx worshiper. I'm not a Marx hater. He had some interesting ideas that are worth looking into and that have been very influential in the modern world. Yeah, Marx really opens up the debate about capitalism, right? As I see here. And this is going to be a central debate of this course, right? So structural functionalism, which is associated with the work of Durkheim, is generally seen as an ideology that's a little bit more friendly to conservatism and capitalism. And of course, folks on the left tend to be particularly enamored with Marx. Now, on the other hand, I can appreciate Marx, but on the other hand, I'm more of a fan of Max Weber than I am of Marx, because I really see Weber as sort of a bridge between the micro and the macro level of sociology. Max Weber was a German sociologist who he got a little bit of a bad name because he was German, and he was German at a bad time to be German, and some folks have associated him with Hitler, but I think that association is loose and not exactly, anyway, I don't want to go too far with that, but he was German, and he did live during World War I and World War II, so like some people think that he was a Nazi just because he was a German during that time. I don't think he was necessarily a Nazi, but he was a German during World War II. But Weber actually had a lot of interesting ideas that I think took Marx's ideas and kind of ran with them a little bit and made them a little bit more sophisticated. I kind of see Weber as sort of like a more sophisticated version of Marx, to be honest, because Weber includes a lot of Marx's ideas. He was influenced by Marx, but he kind of, in my opinion, Weber had a more nuanced view. Weber had a little bit of a more nuanced view of humanity, right? Whereas Marx was only concerned with economics, Weber was also concerned with culture. And he was also concerned with the role that rationalization was playing in our culture, and the roles that bureaucracy were playing. Weber believed that he didn't just believe this, I mean, he observed this. He observed that the world was becoming increasingly scientific. This was an observation that Comte and Durkheim made as well. But the world was becoming increasingly scientific. People are increasingly utilizing the laws of the scientific method and logic to make their decisions. So the world is moving away from religion and superstition towards the scientific method, which he called the process of rationalization, which he was very concerned with in his sociological theories, his theory. He was also very concerned with the rise of the modern bureaucracy and the way that affected people. And bureaucracy are these organizations that just run our lives. So here's an example of bureaucracy, right? So for example, I advise the meditation club here at Pensacola State College, and we created a flyer. We created a flyer for the meditation club last semester, and the marketing department at the college didn't like our flyer. They made us redo it like 2 or 3 times. And it took forever to get our flyer approved. We couldn't just create a flyer and put it on the wall the way we wanted to, right? We had to have the marketing department sign off on it, and several administrators at the college sign off on it. You can't just make a flyer. You've got to have 3 different administrators sign off on it. That's bureaucracy, right? So Weber referred to this as an iron cage, that the modern world is an iron cage of bureaucracy. So Weber he had a much more nuanced view of society. He was concerned with inequality, and he was concerned with capitalism, but he was also concerned with cultural change and the role of bureaucracy in our life. And he wrote a really famous book called The Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism that was really influential, which was about the way that particularly Protestant Christianity influenced capitalism. And Weber had this theory that it was actually Protestant Christianity that kind of gave rise to capitalism through the Protestant work ethic, which was a really interesting theory. So let's take a look at one last video clip on Weber before we call it a day today. And then we'll finish this chapter on Thursday.
Max Weber is one of the philosophers best able to explain to us the peculiar economic system we live within called capitalism. Born in Erfurt in Germany in 1864, Weber grew up to see his country convulsed by the dramatic changes of the Industrial Revolution. Cities were exploding in size, vast companies were forming, a new managerial elite was replacing the old aristocracy. Weber spent his life analysing these changes, and he developed some key ideas with which we can better understand the workings and future of capitalism. The standard view is that capitalism began as a result of developments in technology, especially steam power. But Weber proposed something more interesting, that what actually made capitalism possible was a set of ideas, and in particular, religious ideas. And not just any religious ideas. Capitalism was created by Protestantism, specifically Calvinism. In his great work, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, published in 1905, Weber laid out some of the reasons why he believed Protestant Christianity had been so crucial to capitalism. In Weber's analysis, Catholics have it relatively easy. They're able to confess their transgressions at regular intervals and can be cleansed by priests. But no such purifications are available to Protestants, who believe that only God is able to forgive anyone, and he won't make his intentions known until the day of judgment. Until then, Weber alleged, Protestants are left with heightened feelings of anxiety, as well as lifelong guilty desires to prove their virtue to a severe, all-seeing, but silent God. In Weber's eyes, Protestant feelings of guilt were diverted into an obsession with hard work. This was what he called the Protestant work ethic. The sins of Adam could only be expunged through constant toil. Not coincidentally, there were far fewer festivals and days of rest in Protestantism. God didn't like time off. Catholics had limited their conception of holy work to the activities of priests, monks, and nuns. But now, Protestants declared that work of any kind could be done in the name of God, even jobs like being a baker or an accountant. This lent new moral energy and earnestness to all branches of professional life. In Catholic countries, the family was, and often still is, everything. But Protestants took a less benevolent view of family. The family could be a haven for selfish and egoistic motives. For early Protestants, one was meant to direct one's selfless energies to the community as a whole, the public realm where everyone deserved fairness and dignity. Protestantism and eventually scientific capitalism turned its back on miracles. Weber called this the disenchantment of the world. So prosperity wasn't to be thought of as something mysteriously ordained by God. It could only be the result of thinking methodically, acting honestly, and working industriously and sensibly over many years. Without a belief in miracles, people turned to science for explanations and changes, which encouraged scientific investigation and discovery, and eventually technological booms. Taken together, these 5 factors created in Weber's eyes the crucial catalytic ingredients for capitalism to take hold. Marx had argued that religion was the opium of the masses, a drug that induced passive acceptance of the horrors of capitalism. But Weber turned this dictum on its head. People didn't tolerate capitalism because of religion. They only became capitalists as a result of their religion. There are about 35 countries where capitalism is now well developed. It probably works best in Germany, where Weber first observed it. But in the remaining 161 nations, it arguably isn't working very well at all. This is a source of much puzzlement and distress. Billions of dollars in aid are transferred every year from the rich to the poor parts of the world. But a Weberian analysis tells us that these materialist interventions will never work, because the problem isn't really a material one to begin with. Instead, certain countries for Weber fail to succeed at capitalism because they don't feel anxious and guilty enough. They trust too much in miracles. They like to celebrate now rather than invest in tomorrow. And their members feel it's acceptable to steal from the community in order to enrich their families, favoring the clan over the nation. Today, Weber would counsel those who wish to spread capitalism to concentrate on our equivalent of religion, culture. It's a nation's attitudes, hopes, and a sense of what life is about that produces an economy that either flourishes or flounders. To reduce poverty, Weber would say, one has to start at the level of ideas. What the World Bank and the IMF should be giving sub-Saharan Africa is not, in a Weberian analysis, money and technology, but a new outlook. The decisive question for an economy should not be what the rate of inflation is, but what's on TV tonight. Weber was writing in an age of revolution. He too wanted things to change, but he believed that one first had to work out how political power operated. Weber believed that humanity had gone through three distinct types of power. The older societies operated according to what he called traditional authority, where kings relied on folklore and divinity to justify their power. Then came the age of charismatic authority, where a heroic individual, most famously Napoleon, could rise to power with a magnetic personality and change everything through passion and will. However, Weber explained that we had now entered a third age of bureaucratic authority. Bureaucracy achieves its power via knowledge. Only the bureaucrats know how stuff works, and it will take an outsider years to work it out. Most of us simply give up, usefully for the powers that be. The dominance of bureaucracy has major implications for anyone trying to change a nation. There is often an understandable but misguided desire to think that one just has to change the leader. But in fact, removing a leader almost never has the degree of impact that is hoped for. If we're to get things to go better, much of it will have to come through outwardly, rather undramatic, bureaucratic processes. It will come through the marshalling of statistical evidence, patient briefings to ministers, testimonies to committee hearings, and a minute study of budgets. Weber tells us how power works now and reminds us that ideas may be far more important than tools or money in changing nations. It's a hugely significant thesis. With Weber's guidance, we learn that so much which we associate with vast, impersonal, external forces is in fact dependent upon something utterly intimate and perhaps more malleable, the thoughts in our own heads.
So Weber's ideas are often referred to as the bridge between the micro and the macro. And I think your textbook describes Weber this way as well. Most textbooks describe him that way because Weber had his feet kind of in both. He had 1 foot in the micro and 1 foot in the macro, in the sense that he was interested in how society shapes personal sense of self, right? Weber was very interested in how our social environments shape our sense of self and our sense of identity and the social roles that we play. And that's very much a micro level view. But he also talked about big level, big picture stuff like the economy and culture. So Weber, of the three historical theorists that we've been talking about today, Weber is of those three the one who is the most mixed when it comes to macro and micro. I'll say Durkheim and the structural functionalist theories. Durkheim was looking at the macro level, right? And even though Marx and Durkheim had different views of things, Marx was also looking at the macro level. He was looking at society as a whole. It wasn't really until Weber started doing his work that sociologists started to explore the way that society affects the individual's sense of self. So Weber is often seen as the historical bridge between the macro and the micro. And next time, when we get into symbolic interactionist theory, we will start getting into more formally micro sociology, when we start getting into symbolic interactionism. Yes, absolutely. There will be a study guide. And in fact, it already is posted. I will show you guys where to find it right now. So if you look in the Canvas page and you scroll to the bottom, you'll see the study guides. And then there's chapter 1, right? So some of these terms are terms that you will read about in your textbook because you're reading the chapters, right? I'm assuming that everyone's reading the chapters because they are assigned reading. The textbook is required. So you'll read the textbook and you'll have the lectures recorded. You also have chapter audio outlines you can utilize, and you have the slides posted here in Canvas as well. And I've posted the first 2 chapters of the textbook that you can read, but I can't post beyond that. So next time we will start getting into a little bit more micro-sociology when we discuss the works of the symbolic interactionists. And then next time in the second half of the class period, I've got about a 25-minute long documentary which sums up these 3 major theories, right? And we're going to be applying these theories to various topics throughout the course. So again and again, throughout the course, we're going to be coming back to structural functionalism. We're going to be coming back to conflict theory. And we're going to be talking about symbolic interactionism. And we're going to be talking a little bit about postmodernism a little bit in this class, right? So those are the major theoretical orientations that we're going to keep coming back to again and again. And next time we'll finish the chapter. We'll talk a little bit about structure. We'll talk a little bit about the symbolic interactionist micro theories. And we'll talk a little bit about postmodernist theory too, which I've been kind of getting more into lately, not necessarily as a fan, but I've been diving into more just to inform myself about postmodernism. It's of all the major orientations that we talk about in this class, it's been the one historically that I've known the least about. But over Christmas break, I've been doing a little bit of reading and I've been updating myself a little bit. So I'm going to be talking about postmodernism a little bit more than I have in past versions of this class, just because I think it's a theory that is worth being familiar with, although I'm not, kind of like with Marx, I kind of have an ambivalent kind of love-hate relationship with it. But in any case, we'll pick up here with symbolic interactionism on Thursday, and I'll go ahead and take any questions or comments now if anyone needs to speak with me. If not, that's it today. Anyone need to speak with me? All right. Live long and prosper, my friends. See you guys on Thursday.